Hello and welcome to two new videos, special videos looking at the economics of Brexit. In this video we're going to take a look at some of the key arguments for and against Brexit, and then in the second video our focus will switch towards the exam and we're going to try and crack some A-star evaluation arguments on this really topical issue. So here's the map of the European Union in 2020. As we reach the end of 2020, the UK be outside the European Union after the transition period. Countries such as Iceland and Norway and Switzerland are also non-EU countries, although Norway is actually outside the EU but inside the single market. There have in fact been major enlargements of the European Union over the last 50 or 60 years. And the UK joined in 1973 along with Ireland and Denmark. The Club Med countries joined in the early and mid-1980s, and Austria, Finland and Sweden joined the EU 25 years ago. And then in 2004 there was a big expansion with 10 countries joining, including the Baltic states and also several countries formerly part of the Eastern European Economic Bloc. 3 years later Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU, and the last country to join the single market was Croatia. However, nearly 5 years ago the UK became the first member nation to vote in a referendum to leave the European Union, and we left in January 2020, followed by a 1-year transition period. Now, when the UK leaves, Europe loses about 13% of its population, about 15% of its GDP, and 12% of its budget. If you take the nominal value of GDP in the European Union, it was about just under $19 trillion in 2018, which was about 22% of the size of the world economy. So it's a big trading area. And it's the biggest trading zone for the UK. In 2019, we exported nearly £6 billion worth of goods and services every week, just under a half of our exports, and we imported more. We had quite a significant trade deficit with the European Union of £80 billion. Imports were over half of all UK imports. This chart shows the size of European countries in 2019 converted to euros at current market prices, and you can see that the UK is the second biggest country in the European continent based on this measure, just ahead of France. 3 countries there, Switzerland, Turkey and Norway, feature in the chart. Again, those are countries that are outside the European Union. Germany is Europe's biggest economy by some distance. If you then adjust the European data for GDP and express it at purchasing power parity, in other words, what €100 will buy you will vary from country to country. So if you make an adjustment for living costs, then Europe's share of the world economy is less. It was 17% in 2014, and that's projected to fall. Obviously I've shortened the y-axis here, but by 2024 it's likely that Europe will be less than 15% of the world economy. Now, some people in support of Brexit argue that the European Union is becoming less significant in terms of the world GDP, and perhaps the UK should focus its attentions on trading with faster growing parts of the world. Africa, of course, is an important area, 3% of world GDP, but in fact for the UK only just over half of 1% of our trade is with African countries. United States, our biggest single trade partner, nearly 16% of exports in 2019. But the European single market, which includes, by the way, Norway in this chart, the European single market is our biggest trading partner, both in terms of exports and imports. And that's clearly not going to change fundamentally. You'll be hearing in the media about the concept of a hard Brexit. Well, a hard Brexit means that the UK leaves the single market and we leave the customs union. And if we fail to get a trade deal with the EU, then we have to trade initially, at any rate, under World Trade Organization rules, or WTO rules. Now, under those rules, sometimes reframed under Australian rules, each member must grant the same market access, including charging the same tariffs to all other members as the most favoured nations. So essentially would be tariff-free access to the EU single market would end. A soft Brexit isn't going to happen, but it would have involved the UK perhaps staying inside the single market and staying inside the customs union. Now, Norway is a great example to include in any essay on Brexit. So Norway is outside the European Union for political purposes and things, but actually it's inside the single market, and the four freedoms of goods and services, capital and people are built into that. So Norway is participating in the single market. It doesn't have any formal input or influence into shaping what those rules of the market are, and they have to pay an annual fee, but it does get tariff-free access to the single market. Although it doesn't participate in the CAP, and it doesn't have to adopt EU trade policies with respect to non-EU nations, so it's free to strike out its own trade deals. So what are the arguments for Brexit? What are some of the core arguments put forward by Brexiteers saying that the UK is better off outside the EU? Well, I've tried to capture them in this little summary slide here, so feel free to pause and press the slide button if you want to pause button if you want to take a copy of this. One of the arguments is that many companies in the UK, especially small and medium-sized businesses, they don't actually trade overseas. They're just basically domestic businesses like a taxi firm or a hairdresser or who knows, a pig processing plant, who knows, a meat processing plant. And if you're not trading, but you still have to face the costs of European health and safety laws, environmental standards, all that kind of stuff, the red tape that goes with being part of a supranational organisation. Outside the EU, you wouldn't necessarily face those costs. So it could be a bonus for firms who are then free from EU regulations, although that could, of course, does depend on the regulatory environment that the UK government brings in post-Brexit. The second argument is that Britain is a net contributor to the EU. We pay in about £14 billion a year into the EU based on our GNI and our VAT receipts. We get about £5 billion back in various types of spending. So in net terms, we pay about £8 to £9 billion a year to the EU budget. And of course, the argument is, it was on the bus, wasn't it? If we save that money could then be freed up for spending on healthcare, education, or what have you. Well, that's widely disputed by many, many people. But there is a fiscal saving for the government. Now, I've put the next point in red because I think it's one of those key arguments which are often put forward by supporters of Brexit, that the UK outside the EU is now able to negotiate their own free trade deals with other countries and trade blocs. I'll give you some examples of that in a second. And long term, supporters of Brexit argue that the UK can more or less reinvent itself, perhaps cut corporation tax, become a kind of low tax Singapore style economy, which is highly favourable to inward direct investment. So that would be a kind of shift in the balance of economic policy towards low tax. Two other points: if we're outside the single market, we can now introduce our own labour migration policies. The government favours an Australian style points immigration system, so we would end free movement as part of the single market, and crucially, and this has become a political sticking point, the UK is free to develop its own farm and fishing policies, control over territorial waters. So those are the key arguments for Brexit, I think. I mean, there'd be others, but I think that captures it fairly well. And it would be great application in the exam to include some examples of some of the trade deals the UK has already signed or has signed in principle. Singapore, Canada, Japan, South Korea are some big ones. They've also signed a trade deal with the Southern African Customs Union, which is essentially South Africa. The big one, of course, is Kosovo, £9 million trade deal signed, sealed and delivered. But the UK has already signed a number of trade deals. Evaluation comes in the second video. I mean, the EU is already negotiating or has negotiated trade deals with those countries as well. But the UK is at least striking out and making these deals. Here's the data on our net contribution to the EU budget. As I said before, somewhere between £8 and £9 billion a year. We pay more into the budget than we get out. On the migration side, clearly there has been a rise in migration into the UK in the last 30 years, 40 years, in fact, shown by this data. And migration actually peaked just about at the time, the year before the migration, the Brexit referendum, which might have had an influence on the result. Who knows? People leave, people come in, so the net figure is what matters, and the net figure is shown in grey there. Again, it peaked in 2015 and has fallen since 2019, just under 250,000 net migration into the UK. Now, what about the arguments against Brexit? What do the Remainers say will be some of the consequences of Brexit? I'm going to focus on four key points and then add a bit more detail for you. The first argument is that the UK, you can't avoid it, the European Union is our biggest trade partner and will be, and 45% plus of our trade is with the EU, and therefore if we leave the single market, if that damages trade, there could be consequences for jobs and for investment and living standards pardon me, in the long run. Linked with that, leaving the single market will involve customs delays, we call them trade frictions, things like paperwork, customs delays. Basically that will increase costs for firms, will bring down their profits, and ultimately, if costs go up, it's going to increase prices for consumers. The Confederation of British Industry has estimated that the extra paperwork attached if we leave the EU without a deal, so we're trading under the WTO rules, would act like an extra tariff, and they reckon it would be like a tariff of about 5 or 6%. So trade frictions, non-tariff barriers to trade, NTBs, would effectively act as a tariff. And that's a great analysis and evaluation point to put in. Third argument is that leaving the EU could affect the UK's attractiveness to foreign investors, that there could be a lot of foreign investors based in the UK, build here and then export to the EU. Well, maybe that might suffer. There may be some relocation of operations to countries inside the EU. And maybe some banks and other organisations might relocate their headquarters. And the fourth point really is about the end of open migration, that if you have restricted migration, moving away from the principle of free movement, that could well lead to some labour shortages in key industries, including things like care sectors, hospitality, farming, and the NHS. I think a sizable number of people who work in the NHS are from EU countries. Here's the data on tariffs. It's just worth having some good bits of data in your revision notes for this kind of question. So the average EU tariff in 2019 under WTO rules is it's 11% for fish, 12% for alcohol, 13% for fruit and veg. Then we go to 18% for cereals, 27% for sugar and confectionery, and 32%. That's the average for dairy products. So quite a few UK exporters would face hefty tariffs when they're trying to export into the EU. And a really good answer on Brexit. We'll talk about the sectors that might be hit by a no-deal Brexit in particular. So there could be an effect on the whole economy, but certain industries will be affected more than most. Financial services, for example, our biggest service export, will be able to trade frictionless trade in financial services post-Brexit, who knows. Travel will be disrupted. If you're driving, both as a lorry driver and as a household, if you're driving inside the EU, you're going to need to use a driving permit, green card, proof of insurance. So some extra cost there. The food industry, if tariffs apply, that's going to add to their costs. Estimated it's going to lift the consumer price index by between 3 to 5%, and that could have quite a big impact on low-income families in particular. The impact on the automotive sector, I think, is likely to be quite severe. All cars exported to the UK, produced in the UK, but exported to the EU, I think it's about half of all the cars made in the UK, they would be hit by a 10% import tariff after Brexit. So that would be quite significant. And components would also become more expensive. What about the future for education and research if we leave the Erasmus programme for students and the Horizon programme for research funding? How will farmers respond if they face a 40% tariff on lamb? If they can't get workers from EU countries to pick the fruit and the vegetables in the summer? And what about the NHS? What about the possible drop-off in workers from EU countries? To what extent there will be labour shortages in the NHS? Now, the latest data that I can find was published by the Office for Budget Responsibility in November 2020, and they published a neat table showing the impact on UK GDP, essentially growth, over the next 15 years or so, relative to where it would have been without Brexit. And the estimate is that with a free trade agreement, the average fall in GDP over 15 years will be at 4%, which is about £80 billion or about £3,000 per household. So there would be a cost. If we don't get a trade deal, the cost to the UK would be much more significant, more than 6% of GDP. So the cost would be much, much bigger. So this is clearly a massive issue. What I've tried to do in this video is just try and summarise for you some of the key arguments for Brexit and the arguments against. So you've got a feel for that. In my next video, I'm going to focus on exam technique and think about how to get superb evaluation comments and phrases into an answer. Okay, thank you very much indeed.